When I first moved into my lake cabin, I thought I had found paradise, a hidden escape where the woods met the water, where mornings smelled of pine and evenings shimmered with the reflection of the moon across the lake, and where I could live free from the constant demands of city life. But what I didn't realize was that paradise came with a self-appointed tyrant in the form of the local HOA, run by none other than Karen, a woman with too much time, control that would have made a dictator proud. And for a while, I tried to ignore her antics. The way she strutted around the neighborhood with a clipboard like some self-declared sheriff, jotting down notes about whose trash cans were out too long or which mailbox paint was fading. But it didn't take long before she set her sights on me, the outsider, the man with the rustic cabin that didn't conform to her cookie-cutter expectations of commune, At first, it was petty things. Letters shoved under my door saying my dock was non-compliant, fines taped to my fence for unapproved exterior modifications, even though the cabin had stood that way for 50 years before I bought it, and passive-aggressive notes warning me that my fire pit smoke was disturbing the harmony of the lake. But things escalated when Karen realized I had no intention of joining the HOA because my property recorded decades before the HOA ever existed, which meant their rules had no legal bearing on me whatsoever. And that realization drove her absolutely insane because she couldn't stand the idea of someone living here, enjoying the lake, fishing off their dock without paying tribute to her petty kingdom. That's when the threats started. Not openly, of course. Karen was clever enough to couch them in official language, like failure to comply may result in service interruptions, and community resources are not guaranteed for non-participants. And though most people might have panicked, I laughed, because what Karen and her board didn't know, what they couldn't possibly realize, was that the very water they thought they controlled, their lifeline, ran directly through my land. Because decades ago, when the community first formed, the developer had negotiated with the original cabin owner, a man who built the very house I now lived in, to run the water supply through his property in exchange for lifetime rights to free water access. And when I purchased the cabin, those rights transferred to me, along with the easement agreement and control over the main valve that fed the HOA's entire gate mode. In other words, every drop that flowed into their homes, every sprinkler that watered their lawns, every faucet that filled their coffee pots in the morning passed through my cabin's plumbing line first. And while I never intended to use that leverage maliciously, because frankly, I just wanted to be left alone, Karen's decision to threaten me with service interruption was laughably ironic, because she was threatening to cut off something she did. Manage. Still, she persisted, escalating her campaign with each passing week, rallying the board to vote on cutting me off, posting notices that I was delinquent in community obligations, and even going so far as to tell my neighbors not to associate with me because I was a free rider benefiting from their resources, though more and more of them began to whisper their doubts, asking how it made sense that my cabin, older than the HOA. The breaking point came one Friday afternoon when I came back from fishing to find Karen and two HOA board members standing by the utility shed on my land, tools in hand, trying to tamper with the master valve that they thought they could shut down to teach me a lesson. I remember walking up slowly, carrying my bucket of fish, watching them struggle with the lock, completely oblivious that they were trespassing on my property, messing with a system they didn't understand, and I asked them calmly, "What exactly do you think you're doing?" Karen spun around, smug as ever, waving a paper that she claimed was an order of enforcement, declaring that I was hereby disconnected from community resources. I laughed so hard I nearly dropped the fish, because not only was the order a piece of nonsense she had typed up herself, it was also the ultimate display of ignorance. Since the valve they were trying to tamper with wasn't my connection to their system, it was their connection to mine. I told them flatly, "You touch that valve again, and you won't just be cutting me off. You'll be cutting off every house in this community, including your own." Karen sneered, called my bluff, and insisted they had the right. But when I produced the original easement agreement from my deed, the look on her face changed from smugness to panic. And that was the moment the tables turned, because suddenly she realized that her threats were hollow, her authority an illusion, and her entire HOA's water supply hung on my goodwill. From that moment on, I knew this war wasn't just about petty fines or bullying. It was about control, about exposing Karen for the fraud she was, and about making sure she never threatened anyone else again. Karen's face that day, twisted between anger and dawning fear, stuck in my mind long after she and her entourage stormed off my property. But if I thought that finally showing her the easement agreement and reminding her that the HOA's precious plumbing line ran straight through my land would put an end to the harassment, I was sorely mistaken. Because if there's one thing Karen couldn't stand, it was losing control. And if there's one thing I've learned about her, see, I've learned about. You take away their illusion of power, they don't disappear. They come back twice as loud, twice as vindictive, and twice as desperate to prove themselves right, even if it means burning everything around them to the ground. So in the days that followed that confrontation, the harassment didn't stop. It shifted, like water finding cracks in a dam, seeping into new forms of pressure, gossip, and sabotage, as though Karen believed that if she couldn't it couldn't stits. Socially, financially, and psychologically, until I gave in. Suddenly, anonymous complaints began flooding the county inspector's office, claiming that my cabin was unsafe, that my dock was illegal, that my septic system was contaminating the lake, all of which triggered a series of inspections that wasted my time, but ultimately found nothing wrong. And I knew exactly who was behind them, because the same day the inspector left, I'd see Karen smirking at the end of my driveway, jotting see Karen smirking at the end of my driveway, jotting C. When that didn't work, she tried turning the neighbors against me more aggressively, telling anyone who would listen that I was stealing their water, that I had somehow hacked into the system and was siphoning it for myself, even though the truth was the exact opposite. And while some people believed her lies at first, especially the ones too afraid of crossing the hoe board, others began to come to me quietly, asking questions, admitting they did. When I realized I had something Karen didn't, facts, proof, and control of a system no one else fully understood. I started keeping records, detailed logs of water flow through my valve, notes of every inspection that came up clean, and copies of the deed showing the easement rights, because I had a gut feeling this was building towards something bigger, that Karen wouldn't stop until she tried something drastic, and when she did, I wanted to be ready. Sure enough, my instincts were right. One night, just as the summer heat peaked and everyone in the neighborhood was relying heavily on their sprinklers and air conditioners, I was woken by a rattling sound outside my cabin, the kind of clumsy metallic noise you hear when someone's messing with tools they don't know how to use. And when I grabbed a flashlight and stepped onto the porch, I caught Karen and one of her board members crouched by the utility shed again, this time with bolt cutters, the master valve. I didn't shout, I didn't call out. I just watched for a moment, letting them fumble and sweat, before finally stepping into the beam of my flashlight and saying calmly, "Funny thing about locks, you can cut them, but they don't fix what you're about to break." Karen nearly jumped out of her skin, but then she tried to regain her composure, waving her bolt cutters like a weapon and snapping that she had authority to do this. I told her flatly, authority doesn't mean a damn thing when you don't own the system you're messing with. And I pointed out that if she twisted the wrong valve in her ignorance, she could rupture the main line, flooding half the community and leaving the other half without a drop of water until a full crew came out to repair it, which would take weeks and cost tens of thousands. Her board member, suddenly realizing the truth in my words, began to sweat, muttering that maybe they should go, but Karen wasn't ready to back down, so she threatened to call the cops, insisting I was obstructing her duties. I laughed and told her to go ahead, because I'd be more than happy to walk the responding officers through the easement agreement and show them the trespassing footage from the cameras I had just installed, which, by the way, were recording her every move at that very moment. That shut her up, at least temporarily, and they left in a huff, but I knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot. Over the next week, Karen escalated in new ways, filing a lawsuit against me on behalf of the HOA, claiming that I was illegally controlling their utilities, that I was endangering the community by holding critical resources hostage. And while at first glance the legal language looked intimidating, my lawyer laughed it off, pointing out that the case was dead on arrival. If Section 2 was the crack in Karen's carefully painted mask, Section 3 was the part where that mask shattered completely, because once the neighbors saw the documents, once they understood that the water they bathed their kids in and brewed their coffee with depended entirely on the valve hidden in my shed, Karen's credibility disintegrated like wet paper. But people like her don't step down gracefully. They double down, and within days she was VP. Flyers screaming about how I was holding the community hostage, comparing me to some cartoon villain, twisting the handle of a dam, laughing while the village starved. And even though most folks rolled their eyes at her theatrics, a small but loud faction of die-hard HOA loyalists rallied to her side, showing up at her hastily called emergency meetings, chanting about suing me, about petitioning the county to seize their water line, about petitioning the county to seize their water line, about dinner and a damn too. Faintest clue how property law actually worked. Meanwhile, I stayed calm, patient, because the thing about leverage is it works best when you don't wave it around constantly. You just let people know you have it, then wait until they make the mistake of testing you, and Karen was nothing if not persistent in her testing. First, she tried intimidation again, sending HOA volunteers to my cabin with clipboards, snapping pictures of my dock and my septic field, muttering about violations as though their presence alone would scare me, but all it did was give me more footage of trespassing to log into my records. Next, she filed another complaint with the county, this time claiming I was running an unlicensed utility out of my shed, as if turning a valve on my own property made me a rogue water company. And when the county investigator came out, I walked him through the easement records yet again, showed him the exact language proving I wasn't selling water. I wasn't profiting from it. I was merely allowing the HOA access through my land, and it merely allowing the HOA access through my land, and it allowing the HOA access through my land, and it more to lay in the Aventur, and the how in the bell, a dime for it. The investigator laughed, shook my hand, and said, "Honestly, if I were you, I'd be billing them." And that sentence planted the seed of my next move, because up until then, I hadn't seriously considered monetizing the situation. But the truth was, maintaining that valve and shed wasn't free, and with the constant stress, legal threats, and harassment, why shouldn't I formalize it? Why shouldn't I show Karen what happens when you push someone too far? So I drafted a proposal, a legal, itemized, reasonable proposal, charging the HOA a monthly maintenance access fee for the plumbing line running through my property, something modest at first, enough to cover inspections, wear and tear, and my time. I mailed it to the HOA board with a deadline, and when Karen saw it, she nearly combusted, storming onto my porch the next morning screeching that I had no right to tax her community. I let her rant for a full 3 minutes before I said quietly, "Karen, I didn't tax anyone. I invoiced you for the privilege of running your infrastructure through my private land." Big difference. She threatened to refuse payment, to sue again, to rally the residents to refuse, but I simply shrugged and told her the truth. If they didn't pay, I had every legal right to terminate access entirely, because the easement granted them use so long as they followed certain conditions, one of which was cooperation with the landowner. Her face went pale at that word, terminate, because for the first time, it dawned on her that this wasn't just me defending my property anymore. This was me holding a lever she couldn't pry from my hand. Predictably, she tried another route. She called in the police, claiming I was extorting the HOA, but when the officers showed up and I presented them with the easement language, the invoices, the logs of trespassing, and even Karen's midnight bolt cutter stunt caught on camera, the officers gave her a look I'll never forget. The look you give someone who's wasting your time, and they told her flatly, "This is civil, ma'am. He's within his rights. Stop calling us for property disputes." Karen looked like she wanted the earth to swallow her right there, but instead, she stormed off, probably straight to her lawyer, because within the week, I got a stiffly worded letter from the HOA's attorney accusing me of abuse of easement privileges and bad faith interference with essential utilities, but my lawyer shredded it in his response, attaching all the same documentation I'd shown the cops, and he added a brutal line at the end. Harassment, trespass, and damages, and seek attorney's fees. That was the first time Karen actually went quiet for more than a few days, and in that silence, I executed my plan more fully. I adjusted the invoices, raising the fees incrementally, framing them as covering not just maintenance, but system oversight, legal review, and liability risk mitigation, all perfectly legitimate terms that essentially meant if you're going to make me babysit your water line, you're going to pay for it. At first, the board balked, but then the residents themselves started to get angry, not at me, but at Karen, because when faucets sputtered or sprinklers failed due to pressure issues I caused with a subtle twist of the valve, they demanded answers, and Karen's bluster about illegal control didn't fly anymore, because now they knew the truth. She had picked a fight with the one person keeping their water flowing, and she had lost. Some residents even began coming to me privately, asking if they could pay their share directly just to avoid the drama. And while I politely declined, I wanted everything on record through the HOA. I noted their frustration because it was fuel, proof that Karen was eroding her own base of support. The tipping point came when the HOA's monthly meeting devolved into a screaming match, half the room demanding Karen resign for wasting money on lawsuits and ignoring the reality of my ownership, the other half clinging to her promises that she would find a way to force me out. I wasn't even there, but 3 different neighbors called me afterward, relishing the chaos, telling me Karen's voice cracked as she tried to maintain control. That night, I sat on my porch, looking out at the lake, and for the first time since this whole war began, I actually felt at peace, not because the battle was over, but because I had finally shifted the balance completely. Karen had thought cutting off my water would humble me. Instead, I controlled hers. She had thought her HOA title gave her authority. Instead, my deed gave me power. And as her grip slipped, I realized this wasn't just about defending my cabin anymore. It was about teaching her and anyone like her that arrogance and entitlement crumble when faced with quiet, undeniable leverage. If Section 3 was about leverage tilting in my favor, Section 4 was where Karen's desperation curdled into recklessness because she couldn't stand that I had outmaneuvered her legally, financially, and socially, and like any cornered predator, she lashed out blindly, hoping that sheer aggression might undo what years of her bullying had built in the neighborhood. But the harder she pushed, the faster everything slipped away from her. The faster everything slipped away from her. And the first, media, calling in a local reporter to spin some sob story about a rogue landowner strangling a peaceful HOA with outrageous fees. And sure enough, a camera crew showed up one morning, catching her on the steps of the clubhouse with crocodile tears in her eyes, ranting about how families were being held hostage by my greed. But she hadn't anticipated that the reporter would also come to me for comment. And when I calmly produced the footage and a neat folder of her legal threats, the entire narrative collapsed, and the reporter actually chuckled, saying, "So she tried to cut off your water first?" And the headline that aired that night wasn't flattering to Karen at all. It read, "HOA president accused of overreach and property dispute," and the residents saw it, the county saw it, even the state saw it, because the story spread further than she ever intended. At credibility. Furious, Karen doubled down, summoning an emergency board session where she screamed about hiring a specialty utility attorney to sue me into submission, but that's when one of the quieter board members finally snapped, slamming their fist on the table and shouting, "Enough, Karen. You've lost us thousands in fees, the county's sick of us, and now you've made us a laughingstock on the news. You are the problem." And apparently the room erupted into shouting so loud that neighbors down the street could hear, and by the end of the night, several board members walked out, vowing to resign rather than keep funding her vendetta. Still, Karen wouldn't quit. She never knew when to fold, and the very next day, she tried something so brazen it bordered on criminal. She hired a local plumber, under the table, to dig onto my property while I was supposedly at work. The plan being to install a bypass valve that would let the HOA reroute the water line around my shutoff, effectively cutting me out of the equation. What she didn't count on was that I work from home more often than not, and when I heard the rumble of machinery in the woods behind my cabin, I grabbed my phone, hit record, and walked right down to find 2 men in hard hats knee-deep in a trench on my land. I didn't yell. I didn't threaten. I simply asked, "Do you have a permit to dig here?" And when they muttered something about Karen's orders, I explained very calmly that they were trespassing on private property, that they were in violation of county code for unauthorized excavation, and that I had their entire operation on video. Their faces turned pale, and one of them actually cursed under his breath, realizing they'd been set up, because Karen hadn't bothered to tell them this was my property. And within minutes, they were packing up their tools, muttering apologies, leaving a half-dug ditch behind them, which I photographed extensively before calling my lawyer and the sheriff. When the deputies came out, I showed them the footage, the trench, the invoices with Karen's signature authorizing the job, and that was the first time law enforcement actually took action against her. Not just. The end of Karen's reign wasn't a sudden explosion, but more like a dam bursting after years of cracks widening. By the time Section 4 closed, she was already ousted in all but name. But what followed was the slow, crushing inevitability of an empire collapsing under its own arrogance. And it was almost poetic to watch it happen. Not because I relished her humiliation, though I'd be lying if I said I didn't take some satisfaction, but be lying if I said I didn't take some satisfaction, but be pin. Control will always self-destruct when exposed to accountability, and the weeks after that explosive meeting became a chain reaction that no one could stop, least of all Karen herself. The first blow was financial. The County Utility Commission sent investigators who went through the HOA's books like wolves picking a carcass clean, and what they found wasn't just mismanagement, but years of Karen's wasteful vendettas, frivolous legal fees, bogus fines, and unexplained administrative charges that seemed to disappear into her personal accounts. And when residents were confronted with this in black and white print, the last were confronted with this in black and white print, the last were confronted with this in black and white print, the last of Planty Edwan Prodi Winteran. Fury, and suddenly the very people who had once clapped along to her crusades were at her front door demanding refunds, answers, and in some cases, blood. She tried to deflect, claimed it was the treasurer's fault, claimed her hands were tied, even claimed I had somehow framed her. But her voice no longer carried authority. It carried the shrill panic of someone drowning, and every time she opened her mouth, more people walked away shaking their heads. The second blow came legally. The sheriff's report about her unauthorized excavation attempt, coupled with my footage and the plumber's testimony, made its way to the county prosecutor, who filed charges for attempted property damage, trespassing, and reckless endangerment of utilities. And though it wasn't the kind of case that would land her in prison, it was enough to drag her through hearings, legal fees, and public humiliation. Not dropped them like a hot potato the moment they saw the liability exposure. The third blow was communal. With Karen stripped of authority, the HOA board fractured, and without her iron fist keeping them cowed, members began openly questioning whether the association should exist at all, pointing out that all the HOA really did was fine people, waste money, and start fights with neighbors, while the lake and utilities, the heart of the community, were never theirs to control in the first place. I didn't even have to campaign. The idea spread organically. Disband the HOA, negotiate directly with me for fair water access, and live without Karen's nonsense forever. Petitions circulated, signatures piled up, and within a month a formal vote was held. By overwhelming majority, the HOA was dissolved, and with it, every bylaw, every fine, every ridiculous restriction evaporated into nothing but paper ash. Karen, of course, didn't accept this quietly. She ranted, threatened, even tried to call for state-level intervention, but her voice had become irrelevant background noise, the wild screech of a woman whose kingdom had turned to dust. And when she realized there was no one left to lead, no dues left to collect, no meetings left to chair, she shut herself inside her house like a wounded animal, blinds drawn, phone calls unanswered. Hair calls unanswered. Hair knows. Palms on unanswered. Hair. Phone calls unanswered. Hair. Phone calls unanswered. Hair. Backyard fences. For me, though, the aftermath was liberation. I finalized legal contracts with the county and with individual homeowners, establishing clear and fair access to the plumbing lines under my ownership. Each household would pay a small, flat maintenance fee directly to me, which I used to upgrade the pipes, install modern monitoring systems, and ensure the lake's ecosystem remained healthy, and in return, they got reliable water at a fraction of reliable water at a fraction of. People thanked me. Some brought homemade pies or beer to my porch. Others shook my hand with tears in their eyes, admitting they'd been afraid of Karen for years, but had never had the courage to stand up to her until I forced the truth into the light. The community changed. Gardens bloomed without fear of fines. Kids laughed louder at the lake without Karen's constant scolding. Neighbors waved to one another without suspicion that someone might report them for a misplaced trash can. It was as if the entire neighborhood had been holding its breath for years, and now, finally, they exhaled, free. The irony was not lost on me. Karen had tried to cut me off from the water, Believing control of that lifeline gave her power, but in the end, it was my control of the plumbing line that severed her from the very lifeblood of her empire, and I didn't have to scheme or bully. I just held my ground, let her own arrogance undo her, and when the dust settled, I wasn't just the man with a cabin on the lake anymore. I was the land. Sometimes the best revenge isn't loud or cruel. It's simply living well while your enemy drowns in the consequences they created. And Karen? She became a cautionary tale, the kind parents told their kids when they warned about bullies, the name people muttered as shorthand for everything wrong with power-hungry HOAs. And though I rarely saw her after that, every so often I'd catch a glimpse of her in town, eyes downcast, shopping bags clutched like shields, and she'd look away fast, as if seeing me reminded her of everything she lost. But I never needed her apology, never needed her recognition, because the lake, the land, and the plumbing line still flowed through my hands, and unlike her, I knew how to manage them with fairness, not tyranny. In the end, Karen thought she could play God with water, but she forgot one simple truth. You can't dam up what doesn't belong to you.